Trade alert. Jaren Jackson Jr. is coming to Utah and bringing back SWAT Lake City. And more importantly, perhaps the playoffs. This is Locked On Jazz.
You are Locked On Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Jazz Nation? I'm Leif Thulin, Utah Jazz stats guy, NBA draft guru, and first and foremost, a diehard Utah Jazz fan. I cannot wait to talk to you about the biggest day in Jazz Nation in 3 years, 4 years, whatever it may be. Let's dive right in. First of all, this trade has to go through before it counts. But the trade, as it stands, is Jaren Jackson Jr. as the headlining piece. He'll be heading to Utah along with John Konchar, Jock Landale, and Vince Williams Jr. for Walter Clayton Jr., Kyle Anderson, Taylor Hendricks, George Niang, and 3 future first-round picks. Now, that's great, but here are the picks. Per the reports of Jake Fisher of Yahoo, the Jazz are trading their most favorable 2027 first-round pick. That's between Cleveland, Minnesota, and Utah. And as well as the Lakers' 2027 first-round pick and the Phoenix Suns' 2031 first-round pick. And those are all going to Memphis. And that's what it takes to pry a big fish like Jaren Jackson from the Grizzlies. And while that's a lot of trade capital and pick capital going to Memphis, I think the important thing to note is knowing that the Jazz had so much pick capital stored up, they needed to use some, or it was kind of going to waste. You needed to use some and be aggressive to use those picks for something, because you can't draft with all those picks because there's too many bases on it. I digress a little bit. They needed to use some progressively, and they did. Now let's address this in 3 parts. What are the Jazz getting in Jaren Jackson Jr.? And what is the risk of dealing the picks? And what has to happen for this to be a home run? Because I think the Jazz could be in the playoffs very soon and could be deep in the playoffs in a little while if 2 things happen. First things first. There's a lot of hypercritical narratives about Jaren Jackson Jr. that may take the precedent, and you're going to see on Twitter and be like, oh, did the Jazz make a right move? But let me break it down very clearly what he is. Jaren Jackson Jr. is criticized because he's great. Jaren Jackson Jr. is criticized for not rebounding enough per his size or being physical enough to play the 5. But what the Jazz are getting, despite those narratives, is they're getting a guy who won the Defensive Player of the Year. Won the Defensive Player of the Year. The Jazz had one of those guys in Rudy Gobert. And boy, did it make a boatload of a difference to have that type of guy looming down low and change things. The last 4 years, you guys should know, it's been woeful defensively. Jaren Jackson Jr. can fix that by himself. He won the Defensive Player of the Year, and you think, okay, we got a defensive guy. Oh, wait, 2 of the last 3 years, this guy scored 22 points per game. And he can step out and shoot, guard many spots on the floor, guard multiple positions effectively. And if you were just to look at him as a resume, he's a 2-time All-Star, a 3-time first-team All-Defensive Team member, and he's on a long-term contract with team control. And that is now the Utah Jazz. Reportedly. Has to go through. With that said, I am elated, absolutely ecstatic about Jaren Jackson Jr. coming to the Utah Jazz. I have long been a huge Jaren Jackson Jr. fan since his Michigan State days. He went 4th in the draft. And for many of the years in which I was working for the Jazz as a stats guy, I have long been a huge fan of him, and then asked Tim Lacombe, who does the pregame show for the radio, as well as Gordy Chiesa, who is fantastic, and he coached under Jerry Sloan and is just one of the smartest basketball minds. He'll forget more about basketball than any of us will ever know. And I asked them about ways to find a guy like Jaren, and we talked about player trades, multiple things. And the Jazz did so, and they didn't sacrifice their immediate timeline or their future timeline. They did so giving up picks, and that is important, no doubt about it. But they gave up picks in a draft that is lesser in the 2027 draft. They also retained a pick, the most important in one of the best drafts in recent memory that's coming up in 2026. And they kept an Ace Bailey. They kept a Keontae George who's blossoming into a star before our eyes. Jaren's awesome. And I think the only part that will take figuring out, really, is the contracts, because he's a pricey player. And I'm beyond excited to see what lineups the Jazz can run out next year. And we'll discuss that along with the financials of it all next on Locked On Jazz. And boy, it's great being back with you guys on Locked On Jazz. It's the last call for football on FanDuel. One final Sunday, one last kickoff. It's the Super Bowl, the final chance to get on the action before the NFL season officially comes to a close. This is Super Bowl 60, and FanDuel's making sure you're right in the middle of it with a special offer just in time for the biggest game of the year. This is where predictions turn into plays, stats turn into storylines, and every snap feels bigger, larger than life. And it's the perfect way to cap off the season to make the Super Bowl even more exciting than it already will be from kickoff to final whistle. Because if you're a new customer, you can bet just $5, and get $200 in bonus bets if you win. So make it count, because after the Super Bowl, the season's over. This is your last call for football on FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of Super Bowl 60. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Welcome back to Locked On Jazz. Leif Thulin with you here. So happy to be back on Locked On Jazz and breaking down a trade that has made me as happy as a Jazz fan as I can remember for the last 4 years since trading Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert. So what the Jazz are doing in trading for Jaren Jackson is they eliminate their 2026 cap space, and that's assuming they re-sign Walker Kessler, which I believe will happen. That is a concern, and that is something you'll see when reading about this trade, that, okay, the Jazz don't have cap space to do much unless they don't sign Kessler. Because then you have up next, you got to retain Keyonte George. That is an important narrative to talk about. But I also want to talk about Jaren Jackson Jr. as a 4. He can play the 5 in certain lineups, but you do not want to start him at the 5. I believe this means the Jazz are going to go in on being a big team, a physical team, and a defensively oriented team with 3 7-footers in the starting lineup, with Walker Kessler in the middle, Jaren Jackson Jr. as a secondary rim protector who can slide his feet and guard multiple positions, and Lauri Markkanen as a 7-foot small forward sharpshooter. That's really, really hard to combat. Not to mention Ace Bailey, 6'9", could be playing the 2 guard. There's other players that are coming up through the pipeline that have size as well. Size is what's winning in basketball right now. And to me, the other part to note is, yes, they eliminate their 2026 cap space, but there's really not an attainable free agent better than Jaren Jackson Jr. this summer. So if the Jazz use their cap flexibility, then we'd all be like, okay, they used it. Well, we just used it now. So I don't see any problem with it. I see no issues with that. And the next question moves to Keyonte George. And to me, that is a good question and a good problem to have, because it's a good problem to have to think about hitting on a guy like Keyonte George at the 16th pick of the draft, and you're going for a second extension, and the guy is a borderline all-star, and having players better than Keyonte George on the roster, and you have to think about that. That's a good problem to have. That's a first-world problem. And the Jazz haven't had many of those recently. And you look at what's on the roster. Lauri, Jaren, and this is proving the Jazz right for keeping Lauri Markkanen. For keeping Lauri Markkanen, the Jazz have been rewarded now with another player of a similar caliber to Lauri Markkanen and Jaren Jackson Jr. In my opinion, a more accomplished player in Jaren Jackson Jr. Then you have a young ascending player in Keyonte George, and the Jazz also have Ace Bailey in the wing, and hopefully a top pick coming up. If you look at Lauri and Jaren, just strictly on the financials, they're likely both overpaid for being the top 2 players on a team. And the Jazz can't win a title with those 2 as their top, standing pat. But what the Jazz can do is they can make this trade work financially by dealing the larger contracts, which they did with Anderson and Niang. And now the more important part of this is the Jazz make this work by winning immediately after this season. And they pay their guys right now in Kessler, in Markkanen, in Jackson, and they have lucrative contracts. And Kessler gets paid handsomely coming back. And then they hit on draft picks. And those guys are on team-controlled deals and on rookie-scale deals. And the way to win right now is get a steal or just a top pick with a rookie-controlled deal, as well as a well-compensated veteran to lead them to the promised land. And the Jazz have not been able to finagle their way into that until now. The Jazz could have Keyonte George, Ace Bailey, a guy like Darren Peterson, AJ DeMonsa, Cam Boozer, and then the heavily compensated Lauri Markkanen and Jaren Jackson. That's a great problem to have. It's fantastic that you have to navigate financial responsibility of how to pay these guys and what to pay them, because now the Jazz can win. And I think the 2026 NBA draft is the most important draft class for the Utah Jazz, maybe ever, but at least since 2005 when the Jazz drafted Deron Williams. We'll discuss the vitality of the 2026 NBA draft to the Jazz after trading for Jaren Jackson and what could propel the Jazz to being a championship contender. Yes, I said championship contender soon. We'll do that next on Locked On Jazz. I want to tell you guys about Indeed, because hiring isn't just about finding someone willing to take the job. It's about finding the right person with the right background who can actually help move your business forward. Why would you hire someone you don't think can do that? And if you want the candidates who match what you're looking for, Indeed sponsored jobs is the move. Hands down, easily the move. Because instead of hoping you find the right person, they stumble across your post. Indeed helps you match with the quality candidates by boosting your job listing to the people who specifically fit your criteria, like skills, certifications, and location. They choose all that stuff for you. It saves time because you're spending less energy sorting through mismatches. And with sponsored jobs, you get your posts seen by the candidates who are actually a fit and will help you out. And here's a stat that says it all. You guys know I love stats. In the minute I've been talking to you, the companies like yours made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time interviewing candidates who will check all your boxes with Indeed sponsored jobs. And I also want to tell you guys all about TurboTax. Tax season doesn't have to take over your life. It's tax season, and this year TurboTax is making your life easier than ever just to hand things off and move on with your day, as opposed to just laboring away at your taxes. With TurboTax full service, you can have your taxes done for you by a trusted local expert from start to finish without the stress or the guesswork. And instead of spending hours trying to figure out the forms, you can meet with a local TurboTax expert or online, and they connect everything for you. They handle everything from W-2s to self-employed forms and get work done for you on every single deduction you desire and you deserve. So for a limited time, you can have your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150 all in. If a TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year, just file by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life. Visit turbotax.com/local to book your appointment today. Welcome back to Locked On Jazz. Leif Thulin with you here. And this is my favorite part of the deal that I'm going to break down for you. I love this deal. I want to be very clear. I love this deal. I saw this deal and a smile that I haven't felt as a little boy loving Utah Jazz since I was tiny, watching Milt Palacio and Gordon Girashek. And then we drafted Deron Williams, and I was a 5-year-old when Deron Williams was drafted, and I was immediately drawn to this guy. The young generation of Jazz fans that will now be becoming Jazz fans, as I did 20 years ago, have a chance to find this player in this upcoming draft. And the Jazz have direction. Whereas recent years, you'd be like, oh, can we get Cooper Flag? Yes, the Jazz were unlucky there. The Jazz were unlucky in landing Cooper Flag. However, the Jazz found themselves toiling in mediocrity as opposed to blowing the season and finding themselves Victor Wembanyama the year before, Stephon Castle the year after that, and landed Taylor Hendricks at 9 and Cody Williams at 10. And so the Jazz did not give themselves enough chances to land the best players available. And yes, tanking's not fun, but the clear part to this story of what can perpetuate the Jazz to being contenders is they need to be bad the rest of this season, need to be awful, and find themselves with a top 4 pick. For a reminder to the Jazz fans listening, the Jazz only get to draft with their own draft pick this year if it lands within the top 8, or else the Thunder get it. Now, the part that's important to this is that the Utah Jazz are right now in a precarious situation because you can fall as many as 4 picks backwards from the spot you land. And right now, the Jazz would lose their pick. The Jazz need to land within the top 4 to guarantee they have a top 8 pick. Ideally, the lottery gods protect the Jazz, and the Jazz land a top 4 pick. A Darren Peterson, A.J. DeBonsa, Cam Boozer, Caleb Wilson. And the Jazz all of a sudden have a core to contend and a timeline that's clear. So let me dive through why Jaren Jackson is the key to this. So much has been made of the stockpile picks that the Jazz had and possessed and still possess it to some degree. But they needed to consolidate. We all knew that the Jazz couldn't have, 12, 22-year-olds and under. It would be interesting, but the Jazz won't be needing them as desperately if this year the Jazz land in the top 4 and ideally in the top 3, because the trajectory of the Utah Jazz could change and alter for both the immediate future and in the long term should we get just a sliver of luck, because now the Jazz have a defensive identity with Kessler and Jaren Jackson. The Jazz have the scoring chops with Lauri Markkanen and Jaren Jackson and Keyonte George, all north of 20 per game in 2 of their last 3 seasons. The Jazz have, or in Keyonte's case, 1 of the last 3, but obviously it's his 3rd season. I know that takes luck for the Jazz to land one of these guys, one of the top 3. But what I love, luck aside, is it makes evidently clear that the Jazz want to win, but it also makes clear the immediate direction that the Jazz are heading in, which is if we get a Darren Peterson, who is my choice, I'll be perfectly clear about that, and AJ DeBonsa or a Cam Boozer, the Jazz are set to compete with the vets being paid well and the young guys who really control the franchise. The franchise would belong to one of those 3 should the Jazz draft him. And then there would be a guy like Keyonte George, who's a blossoming star, who would be riding shotgun alongside a guy like Darren Peterson. Let's stay with Darren Peterson for the example. And then you have the leadership and all-star ability of Jaren Jackson and Lauri Markkanen, along with the defensive presence of Walker Kessler, to all grow together. And Jaren Jackson's played a lot. He's played important games, but the guy was drafted 4th overall in 2019 or 2018. He's young. He is a young player. And the Jazz would be able to have a true chance to contend with depth, and they've done it the right way. They made a forward-thinking move to make those times of, why are we doing this? Why are we losing? And now to trade to win, you may say you need to thread the needle, and there is risk. But it's a worthwhile risk, because if the Jazz thread the needle and land a top 4 pick in this draft, the Jazz could be in the playoffs next year, not the play-in, the playoffs. And in 2 years after that, could be one of the better teams in the entire NBA. And it makes the moves or the trades that the Jazz made and lost their picks coming up far less important, because if the Jazz are good, whose pick are we going to be giving up? The 2027 is the best pick, meaning the worst team of the 3. And the Jazz are going to be in the playoffs according to this situation. And then the 2027 Lakers pick is one that is less important to me, because they got Luka Doncic, and it wasn't just an aging LeBron James and injury-prone Anthony Davis like it was when we made that trade. So Luka threw a wrench in the Jazz's plans there. That lost value. The Suns and Timberwolves have guys like Devin Booker and Anthony Edwards who make life good in the sense that it makes it hard to be bad enough to be in the doldrums, to have a bad pick, which makes it an appealing thing. Like the Grizzlies are hoping the Jazz do not get a good pick this year, because that could really throw a wrench in their plans and their rationale for making this pick. And in 2031, it's too hard to forecast. Who can really forecast what players will even be on a team then when Luka Doncic was traded out of the blue last February? And the Jazz, even if this does not work perfectly and the Jazz don't land one of the top guys, let's say they land somewhere between 5 and 8, you could get a Keaton Wagler, a Kingston Flemings, a Koa Pete, someone like that. And it still helps move the franchise forward. I still believe the Jazz would find themselves in the play-in next year. You need a precocious talent to take you to the playoffs. And I think the Jazz have a possibility of landing a precocious talent that takes you to the playoffs next year, and then into true, serious contention for the first time since Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert. And I worked for the Jazz the last year they were together. And though the Jazz were good, though there was winning, you could feel that year the Jazz weren't going to advance. Even if they had beaten the Mavericks with Luka missing 2 games, you weren't going to truly threaten. The year before, the Jazz had a chance to truly threaten, were beaten by the Clippers. The Jazz were banged up. We all know that. We haven't felt contention since then when the Jazz were a 1 seed. And all of a sudden, the Jazz could get a player more talented than any that they may have had in Darren Peterson, in AJ DeBonsa. Those guys would probably be higher in terms of the talent commodity than a guy like Darren Williams, certainly higher than a guy like Donovan Mitchell, who's picked 13th. And I'm not saying they'll be better. I'm not assuring you that, because Donovan was great. Darren was great. Gobert was great. but you need franchise level talents, the guys that can transcend a franchise and alter the trajectory of a franchise. And the Jazz have a chance of getting that still while acquiring a guy who has been a defensive player of the year, a 3-time all defensive team member, and a 2-time all-star in just 6 years, just 8 years of his career. And he missed a year. So 7 years of playing basketball. Young, fits the timeline, elevates the players, and works exceedingly hard. The Jazz have a long way to go before this is a reality, but I cannot be more excited. Darren Peterson, Keontae George, Lauri Markkanen, Jaren Jackson Jr., Walker Kessler, and then Ace Bailey off the bench is a lineup that I'd have dreamt of at the start of the Gobert and Donovan being dealt saga that we've lived through for 4 years now. It took a while, but this move proves it can be swiftly on the horizon, and it is possible. And that trade wasn't a mistake to send Rudy Gobert to the Timberwolves, and he makes the Western Conference Finals. And that team's good enough so those picks don't yield anything. The Jazz have made a forward-thinking move, an aggressive move that does come with risk, and prove it's possible to move into the right direction and be a winning team, which is the goal of Ryan Smith, which is the goal of the Ainges. And I think the Jazz handled it somewhat poorly in terms of winning when Victor Wembanyama was on the horizon. And they ended with the 9th pick in the draft. That was poorly handled. The year after that, they were 26-26 through a bunch of games, through 52 games, and finished 5-25 the next 30. And they ended with Cody Williams. And I actually think Cody Williams will be good. He's the best defender on the Jazz right now. But there's a difference between those guys and Victor Wembanyama's, Cooper Flagg's, and Darren Peterson. The Jazz got unlucky, didn't land Cooper Flagg. Ace Bailey's a heck of a consolation prize. Yeah, we don't know if we're going to get Peterson, DeBonsa, or Boozer, but there's a chance. So it's very clear the Jazz must lose the rest of this season and give themselves a chance, a crack at the bat of getting a transcendent talent to complement a guy like Jaren Jackson, a guy like Keontae George and Lauri Markkanen, who now move the Jazz forward into a chance to win even without those guys. If the Jazz get them, the Jazz are on the way to being true contenders. The direction is finally clear, and I'm ecstatic at the possibility of being playoff bound sooner rather than later, and the aggressive forward-thinking nature of this trade gives me so much hope for the trajectory of the Utah Jazz. Let's pray for Darren Peterson, and now the Jazz could be contenders soon. But Jaren Jackson was the catalyst, and he moves the needle, even by himself, big time. Big time. It's always a pleasure talking ball with you guys. And as always, I want to tell you, go Jazz. But especially today, go Jazz.